My son called to tell me I wasn't welcome at my own grandson's graduation party. He did it on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting on the back porch reading a brief from my old law school colleague. I remember the exact moment because I had just set down a glass of sweet tea and was watching a cardinal sit on the fence post near Eleanor's rose garden. She planted those roses the year Tyler was born. She never got to see him graduate. Kevin's voice was careful when he said it. He had practiced this. I could tell the way I used to tell when a witness on the stand had rehearsed their testimony too many times. The words were too smooth. There were no natural pauses, no verbal stumbles. He said Sandra's parents were flying in from Portland and the venue had strict capacity limits and they wanted the evening to feel intimate. Intimate. That was the word he used. Intimate. As if a grandfather watching his only grandchild accept a diploma was somehow an imposition on the occasion. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I watched the cardinal fly away. Then Kevin said, "You understand, right, Dad? It's just logistics." I told him I understood completely. I hung up the phone. I picked up my sweet tea and finished it slowly, watching the roses sway in the Georgia afternoon breeze. Then I walked inside, sat down at my desk, and started making a different kind of list. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you believe that loyalty is earned and that generosity without respect is just exploitation with a smile, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what I'm about to share took me 68 years and one very expensive lesson to understand. My name is Walter Haynes. I spent 35 years as a federal judge in the Northern District of Georgia. I presided over everything from corporate fraud to civil rights cases. I have heard lies delivered with a straight face by people who had coached themselves for weeks. I have watched men in $1,000 suits try to talk their way out of ironclad evidence. After 3 decades on that bench, I can tell you one thing with absolute certainty. The law doesn't care about your feelings. It cares about what you did. My wife Eleanor died 2 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end. She was the kind of woman who kept everything running smoothly, the family dinners, the birthday calls, the quiet diplomacy between me and Kevin when things got tense. When she was gone, I thought the family would pull together. That's what I believed. That's what I told myself at her funeral while Kevin stood next to me with his arm around my shoulder and Sandra dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. I should have paid more attention to who was crying for Eleanor and who was already calculating what came next. Kevin is 43 years old. He works in commercial real estate, which means he spends most of his time having expensive lunches and very little time actually closing deals. Sandra manages a boutique in Buckhead that has been hemorrhaging money since she opened it 4 years ago. They have a son, Tyler, who just graduated from Emory University. Tyler is a good kid. He always has been. Quiet, thoughtful, the kind of young man who sends a thank you note without being reminded. I paid for Tyler's education, all 4 years. Tuition, room and board, a monthly living stipend, and a study abroad semester in Edinburgh. The total came to $240,000. I paid it because Tyler earned a partial merit scholarship, and I wanted to make sure he could focus on his studies instead of working 2 jobs. I also paid it because Kevin and Sandra, despite their lifestyle, do not have $240,000. They have the appearance of $240,000, which is a different thing entirely. They live in a house on Lanier Drive in Dunwoody. It's a 4-bedroom colonial with a screened porch and a fenced backyard where Tyler used to throw a baseball around as a kid. I bought that house in 2009 as an investment property. Kevin and Sandra moved in 3 years ago when their condo situation became, as Kevin called it, complicated. I told them they could stay for a year while they sorted things out. That was 3 years ago. They have never paid $1 of rent. They have never paid $1 of utilities. I carry the property taxes and the homeowner's insurance and the HOA fees because the deed is in my name and, apparently, because I never said the words out loud that needed to be said. I also gave Kevin a supplementary card on my American Express account 4 years ago when he told me he had a cash flow gap between commissions. The gap, as it turned out, was structural rather than temporary. In the past 12 months, that card had charges totaling roughly $89,000. Golf memberships, a wine club subscription, 3 separate weekend trips to Hilton Head, a custom suit from a tailor on Peachtree Street that cost $4,300. Sandra had her own supplementary card. I'll spare you the details, except to say the words spa retreat appeared on the statement 7 times. I knew all of this. I had the statements. I had reviewed them carefully, the way a judge reviews a case file before sentencing. I had said nothing because Eleanor always softened these conversations, and without her, I kept finding reasons to wait. 1 more month, 1 more quarter. He'll figure it out. They'll grow into it. Tyler's graduation party was in 3 weeks. It was a Saturday evening event at a venue in Midtown that Kevin had told me cost $8,000 to rent. He mentioned this to me twice, which in retrospect was his version of a fundraising pitch. I wired the money the next morning without being asked. $8,000 for a party I had just been told I was not invited to. I sat at my desk and looked at the bank confirmation on my screen. The wire had gone out 48 hours ago. I picked up the phone and called my attorney. Her name is Margaret Chen. She went to law school at Georgetown, clerked for the 11th Circuit, and has been handling my estate and property matters for 11 years. She is the most organized person I have ever met, and I spent 3 decades surrounded by lawyers. When she answered, I said, "Margaret, I need to talk through some options." She said, "Judge, from your tone, I'm guessing these aren't pleasant options." I said, "They're not." I told her everything. The phone call from Kevin, the party, the house, the credit cards, the $240,000 I had paid toward Tyler's education. I told her about the $8,000 wire that had cleared 2 days ago. I read it all to her from the ledger I keep on my desk, the same kind of detailed records I kept for 35 years on cases. Margaret was quiet while I talked. She took notes. I could hear her pen moving against a legal pad. When I finished, she said, "I want you to listen to me carefully, Walter. Do you want to pause and think about this before we move forward?" I said, "I've been thinking about it since Eleanor died. I'm done thinking." She said, "All right, then let's go through this properly." The first thing we discussed was the house. Margaret confirmed what I already knew. The deed was in the name of the Haynes Family Trust, of which I am the sole trustee. Kevin and Sandra had no lease. They had no rental agreement of any kind. They were, in the legal definition of the term, tenants at will, which meant I could revoke that invitation with a formal notice to quit and a 30-day clock. The second thing we discussed was the American Express cards. Those were straightforward. I was the primary account holder. I could cancel the supplementary cards at any time with a single phone call. Margaret advised me to document the balance and any pending charges first, which I did. The third thing we discussed was more complicated. Margaret asked me whether I had ever formalized the financial support I had provided to Kevin and Sandra as loans or as gifts. I told her they were never formalized as anything. She said that was a problem in terms of recovering the money, but it was also useful for a different reason. Because if I had simply been providing generosity at will, I could stop that generosity at will. There was no contract obligating me to continue. She said she would have the eviction notice prepared by Friday. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called American Express. The representative was polite and efficient. I told her I wanted to cancel 3 supplementary cards on my account. She asked for the names. I gave them. Kevin Haynes, Sandra Haynes. She confirmed the cancellations and told me the cards would be declined on any future transactions immediately. I asked her to note on the account that this was an authorized cancellation by the primary account holder due to misuse. She said, "Of course, sir. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" I said, "That'll do it." I hung up and looked at the clock. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. Kevin and Sandra were probably sitting down to dinner right about now, still confident that they had managed the old man successfully. Still confident that their polite, rehearsed little conversation had landed exactly the way they intended. I walked to the kitchen and made myself a proper dinner. Grilled salmon, roasted asparagus, a glass of the Sonoma Coast Pinot I had been saving for no reason in particular. I ate alone at the kitchen table, which I do most evenings, and I thought about Tyler. I thought about him sitting in a cap and gown at graduation, taking a picture with his parents, and not knowing what his parents had done. I decided to call him before anything else escalated. He deserved to hear something from me directly. I left it for the next morning. I slept better than I had in months. The following morning, I called Tyler. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he wasn't avoiding me. He said, "Hey, Grandpa." I said, "Congratulations on graduating, Tyler. I'm very proud of you." There was a pause. A real pause, not a rehearsed one. Then he said, You know, don't you? I said, Your father called me. Another pause. Longer, this time. Then Tyler said, Grandpa, I didn't know about this. I swear to you. My mom told me yesterday that there was a seating issue and that you were going to come to a separate dinner with us afterward. I thought that was strange, but I figured you'd agreed to it. His voice was tight. I was going to call you today. I've been trying to figure out how to say. I told him to stop. I told him I believed him. I told him this was not his problem to fix and that I was proud of him for graduating and that would never change regardless of what happened in the next few weeks. He was quiet for a moment, and then I could tell from his breathing that he was trying not to cry, which is something Tyler has done since he was 7 years old when he didn't want anyone to know he was upset. I told him, You're going to be fine. Focus on yourself right now. He said, Grandpa, what are you going to do? I said, What I always do. Apply the law. He didn't fully understand that. He would understand it soon enough. The eviction notice arrived from Margaret's office by Friday afternoon, as promised. She had it served by a process server on Saturday morning at 9:15, while Kevin and Sandra were home. I know this because my neighbor on Lanier Drive, a retired school principal named George Whitfield, who I have known for 20 years, happened to be walking his dog past the house and sent me a text message that said simply, Man in a suit just put something on Kevin's door. Kevin looked like he ate something bad. I appreciated George's editorial commentary. I was at my own house when Kevin called 40 minutes later. I let it ring through to voicemail. Then Sandra called. I let that go too. Then Kevin called again, and this time, I answered because I was ready. His voice was not practiced this time. It was raw, the way people get when the carefully constructed version of themselves falls apart unexpectedly. He said, Dad, what is this? There's a man who left papers. It says eviction. What is going on? I said, Good morning, Kevin. He said, Don't do that. Don't be calm. There's an eviction notice on my door, our door. What are you thinking? I told him I was thinking quite clearly. I told him the notice to quit gave them 30 days to vacate the property at Lanier Drive. I told him the cards had been canceled as of Wednesday. I told him that the property had been listed with a real estate agent that morning and that showings would begin the following Saturday, so I would appreciate it if the house was kept presentable for visitors. There was a long silence. Then Kevin said, very quietly, Because of the party. I said, Kevin, the party is a symptom. It is not the disease. He said, Dad, we can fix this. We can talk about the party. Sandra overreacted. She gets anxious about her parents. And I said, Your wife didn't make this decision. You called me. You rehearsed it. I've been in courtrooms for 35 years, son. I know the difference between a nervous man saying hard words and a man delivering a prepared statement. You prepared that. He didn't say anything. I said, You have 30 days. He said, Where are we supposed to go? We don't have. I said, I know exactly what you have and what you don't have, Kevin. You have a monthly income from your real estate work, which varies. You have a wife who runs a boutique. You have options. They're just not comfortable options. And they're not ones I'm going to provide for you anymore. He hung up. 15 minutes later, Sandra called, and her approach was different. Sandra went for the emotional register. She was crying, which I do not believe was entirely manufactured. She told me she was sorry about the party. She told me that her mother has difficulty with social situations, and that it had nothing to do with me personally. She told me that Kevin had been under enormous stress, and that she should have handled the conversation herself, instead of asking him to call. I listened to all of it. I am not an unfeeling man. 35 years on the bench teaches you that people are almost always more complicated than the worst thing they've done. I do not hate Sandra. I never have. But I have learned, at a great cost, that compassion, without accountability, is just enabling with better vocabulary. I told Sandra that I accepted her apology as genuine. I also told her that the apology did not change the material situation, which was that she and Kevin had been living in my house for 3 years without rent, running up my credit cards, and had recently decided that their generosity toward me extended to informing me I was not welcome at an event I had paid $8,000 to fund. I told her those 3 things together painted a picture that a compassionate reading could not fully erase. She said, Walter, please, where will we go? I said, That's a question you should have been asking 3 years ago when you first moved in. I ended the call. My hands were perfectly steady. I walked to the window and looked at Eleanor's roses, which were coming in beautifully this year. A full bloom, deep red, the kind of red she always said looked like they were arguing with the sky. I said, "You'd tell me I'm being hard on them." The roses didn't answer, but I knew what she would have said. She would have said I was probably right, and that she loved me, and to at least make sure Tyler was okay. That was Eleanor. She always held two truths at once, without dropping either of them. 3 days after the eviction notice was served, Margaret called me. Her voice had a quality to it that I recognized from my time on the bench. It was the tone people use when they found something unexpected in a case file. She said, "Walter, I need you to come into the office. There's something you need to see." I drove into Midtown the next morning. Margaret's office is on the 14th floor of a building on West Peachtree, with a view of the skyline that Eleanor always said looked like a promise the city was making to itself. Margaret was at her desk when I came in. She had a folder open in front of her, and she got straight to the point, which is one of the many things I have always appreciated about her. She slid a document across the desk. It was a home equity line of credit application from Pinnacle National Bank. The property listed as collateral was the house on Lanier Drive. I looked at the signature on the last page. Walter J. Haynes. I sat very still for a moment. Then I said, "I didn't sign this." Margaret said, "I know you didn't. The application had been submitted 7 weeks ago. The requested line was $75,000. The bank had flagged it and declined because the Social Security number on the application did not match the credit profile associated with my name, the profile that shows I have never missed a payment in my life, which apparently made the numbers look wrong to their fraud detection system. The bank sent a letter to the address on file, which was the house on Lanier Drive, not my house. Kevin or Sandra intercepted it. I looked at the signature again. It was a reasonable attempt. It had the right initials. The J was there for James, my middle name. But I spent 35 years signing my name to federal orders, and my hand has a particular habit at the end of the S that no one who knows my handwriting would mistake. Whoever signed this didn't know that habit. They were working from a copy. I said, "This is a felony." Margaret said, "First-degree forgery in this state, yes. Attempted bank fraud. We have the declined application with the forged signature, the bank's internal fraud flag, and the certified letter that was mailed to Lanier Drive." I looked out the window at the skyline. I thought about the morning Kevin called to tell me I wasn't welcome at the party. I thought about how smooth his voice was, how prepared he sounded. I thought about the fact that he submitted this application 7 weeks ago, which was 3 weeks before he made that phone call. The timeline was not a coincidence. He had applied for the loan. It was declined. He was already in trouble. The phone call excluding me from the party had nothing to do with Sandra's parents or capacity limits. It was a stress response from a desperate man who was trying to regain control of a situation he had already badly misjudged. I said, "File the criminal complaint." Margaret looked at me carefully. She said, "Walter, he's your son." I said, "I know." She said, "Once we file, this goes to the DA's office. They'll make their own decisions about charges. Kevin could be looking at a felony conviction." I said, "I know what a felony conviction means, Margaret. I spent more than 3 decades deciding what to do with them." She said, "I have to ask you one more time. Are you certain?" I looked at the signature. My name in someone else's hand, on a document designed to steal from me in the middle of a night while I was sleeping in my house alone, 2 years after I buried my wife, while I paid their rent and their groceries and their golf club fees without complaint. I said, "File it." The next 2 weeks were what I would call a controlled demolition. The house was shown to 4 prospective buyers. An offer came in on the 12th day. I accepted it. Kevin and Sandra received formal notification of the sale and a reminder that their 30 days would end before the closing date, which meant they would need to be out sooner. Kevin came to my house unannounced on a Thursday evening. I heard the car in the driveway, and I knew it was him from the particular way he hits the brakes too hard at the end. Eleanor used to joke about it. I was in the kitchen when he knocked. I let him in. He looked tired. He was wearing clothes that were a little too expensive for the expression on his face, which is something I had been noticing about him for years. The clothes said one thing, and the man inside them said something else entirely. He sat down at the kitchen table, and I poured him a glass of water because that felt like the right thing to do. He said, "The bank called me." I didn't say anything. He said, "Dad, I need you to understand. I was going to pay it back." The line of credit was just a bridge. I had a deal closing in Alpharetta that was going to cover everything. It fell through. I didn't know what to do. I said, "You could have called me." He looked at the table. He said, "I couldn't." I said, "Why not?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because you would have known I had nothing. You would have seen all of it." I said, "Kevin, I already knew all of it." He looked up. I said, "I've been watching the statements for 2 years. I know about the Hilton Head trips. I know about the tailor. I know that Sandra's boutique has been losing money since the second quarter. I am not a foolish man. I was a foolish father, which is a different thing," he said quietly. "Then why did you keep paying?" I said, "Because your mother would have wanted me to give you the chance to come to me yourself." I looked at him. "She's been gone 2 years, Kevin. You haven't taken it." He put his face in his hands. He sat like that for a while, and I let him, because that kind of grief, even when it's a man sitting at his father's kitchen table at 43, deserves a moment to be what it is. When he looked up, his eyes were red. He said, "What happens now?" I said, "That depends on what you do next." He said, "The criminal complaint," I said, "is filed. I can't undo that without the DA's cooperation, and I'm not inclined to call in a favor to make a forgery disappear. But I can write a letter to the prosecutor's office that speaks to your character and your circumstances and asks them to consider the full picture." I paused. "Whether I write that letter depends entirely on what you choose to do next." He said, "What do you want me to do?" I said, "I want you to be honest with me for the first time in a very long while. Tell me exactly what you owe, all of it, not just to me, to everyone. I want to understand the actual structure of what you've built, because a man who can see his own problems clearly is a man I can work with. A man who keeps papering over the cracks is a man I cannot help." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. We sat at that kitchen table until 10:30 at night. He told me everything, and it was bad. It was not catastrophic the way it could have been, but it was the kind of bad that comes from years of small decisions that each seemed survivable on their own but had compounded into something genuinely serious. There were other debts. There were missed payments. The boutique situation was worse than I had understood, but Kevin was honest. He looked at the table more than he looked at me, but he was honest. And that was something. That was the beginning of something, at least. I did not hand him a check. I want to be clear about that. I told him the house sale was proceeding and that the equity from the sale, after carrying costs and fees, belonged to the trust. I told him I would make a call to a financial counselor I trusted and that I would cover one session, not to give him money but to give him a map. I told him that the party, the exclusion, the phone call, I needed him to understand that those things had hurt me in a way that the money never could. That being discarded by his family after 2 years of grief was a wound that would take time. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I know that's not enough." I said, "It's a start." He left that night not fixed, not absolved, but facing in the right direction for the first time in a long while. Sometimes that's the most you can do for a person. Tyler came to see me the following Saturday. He drove himself, didn't tell his parents, and showed up at my door with a bag of groceries because, as he explained with that quiet seriousness of his, he had looked up my favorite recipe online and he wanted to cook dinner. It turned out to be Eleanor's recipe for shrimp and grits that she had published in a church cookbook 20 years ago and that had apparently made it onto a food blog at some point. He cooked. He was not entirely graceful in the kitchen, but he was earnest, and he didn't quit when the roux gave him trouble. I sat on a stool and talked him through it the way Eleanor would have talked me through it, and by 7 o'clock we were sitting at the same kitchen table where I had sat with his father and eating something that was genuinely very good. Tyler said, "I want to pay you back." I said, "Tyler." He said, "Not all at once. I know I can't do that. I have a job starting in August. I'm going to set up a payment plan, and I want you to know the amount and hold me to it." He looked at me steadily. He had Eleanor's eyes. "You paid for my education. That was your choice, and it was a generous choice. But I don't want to live the way my parents lived. I don't want someone else's generosity to become something I just expect." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the cardinal on the fence post. I thought about Eleanor's roses. I said, "You know what the difference between a gift and a loan is?" He said, "What?" I said, paperwork and expectation. Your grandmother and I paid for your education because we believed in you, not because we expected repayment. But I'll tell you this, the fact that you came here and said what you just said is worth more to me than $240,000. That's the return I was hoping for. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Grandpa, are you and my dad going to be okay? I said, that depends on your father, but I think he wants to be. And sometimes wanting to is the hardest part of actually getting there. Tyler nodded. He said, I told him he was wrong. About the party. About all of it. I told him the week it happened. I said, I know you did. He looked surprised. I said, you're your grandmother's grandson. Of course you did the right thing. We finished dinner. We watched a baseball game afterward. The Braves against somebody. Neither of us paying full attention. Just sitting in the same room in the way families sometimes do when they're quietly repairing something without naming what they're repairing. He left at 10, and I walked him to his car, and he hugged me the way young men hug when they're trying to say something words won't fully hold. The house on Lanier Drive closed 6 weeks later. The new owners were a young couple with a toddler and another one on the way. They liked the yard. I liked the idea of that yard being used the way a yard is supposed to be used. Kevin and Sandra had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Chambly. It was a significant downsize. Kevin had started working with a financial counselor. I did not pay for the counselor after the first session. I gave him the referral and the first meeting, which was what I had promised. The DA's office reviewed the criminal complaint. Margaret worked with them carefully. The forged signature application, combined with Kevin's cooperation and his acknowledgement of the act in a voluntary statement he gave at her office, resulted in a deferred prosecution agreement. No trial, no conviction on his record, provided he completed financial counseling, paid a fine, and committed no further violations for 2 years. It was the outcome Margaret had quietly worked toward from the beginning. She is better at her job than most people realize. I did not attend Tyler's graduation party. I never did, but 3 weeks after it happened, Tyler and I drove to Amelia Island together, just the two of us, and spent a weekend at the same cottage where Eleanor and I used to go every October. We walked the beach in the mornings and ate at the little seafood place on the harbor and stayed up too late the second night talking about everything he was planning to do with his life. He told me he wanted to go to law school. He'd been thinking about it for a year, but hadn't said anything because he wasn't sure it was practical. I told him the law was many things, but impractical wasn't one of them. He said, would you write me a recommendation? I said, I've been waiting for you to ask. There is a version of this story that ends with me as a man who destroyed his family for the principle of the thing. I have heard that version from people who want a simpler story than the one that actually happened. The truth is more uncomfortable than that, which is something I learned 35 years ago watching juries wrestle with complicated cases. The truth is that I did what I did not out of anger and not out of revenge, though I understand why it looked that way from the outside. I did it because I had been enabling a structure that was going to collapse on its own eventually. And when it collapsed on its own, Kevin and Sandra would have no framework for rebuilding. They needed to meet the ground. They needed to feel it. They needed to understand that no one was going to soften the landing forever. A judge who lets bad decisions go without consequence is not being kind. He is being derelict. I am not Eleanor. I cannot hold two truths at once with the same grace she could. But I am learning. I call Kevin on Sunday mornings now. The calls are short and a little careful, the way conversations are when trust is still under reconstruction. We don't talk about the forgery. We don't talk about the party. We talk about Tyler, mostly, and about the Braves. And sometimes about things Kevin is working on that are smaller and more honest than the deals he used to describe when he was trying to impress me. Last Sunday, he told me that the apartment they're in has a community garden plot out back, and that Sandra has been growing tomatoes. He said it the way you say something small that has become unexpectedly important. I told him Eleanor would have loved that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yeah, she would have. I walked out to the back porch after we hung up. The roses were in full bloom, deep red, arguing with the sky the way Eleanor always said they did. I stood there and watched them for a while, in the morning light. The cardinal was back on the fence post. Or maybe a different cardinal. I couldn't be sure. I poured what was left of my coffee into the grass below the roses, the way Eleanor used to do because she said they liked the nitrogen, which I have since been told is not actually true, but I do it anyway. Some things you keep because they're right. Some things you keep because they were hers. And some things you let go of because holding on to them any longer would have crushed both of you under the weight of what they were never designed to carry. I know the difference now. It took me 68 years and one very clear Tuesday afternoon to understand it. But I know it now.